Hello, I'm Dr. Elna Rudolph, and I'm the clinical head of My Sexual Health. And it gives me a great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, which is Understanding the Brakes and Accelerators of Sex with Professor Erick Janssen. Welcome, 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 Erick. It is wonderful to have you here, and thank you very much for joining us.
You're very welcome. Thank you for that nice introduction. My main job currently, actually, is I'm professor and program director in Belgium, but I indeed am still actively affiliated with the Kinsey Institute. Very happy to be here and to join you.
I'm just going to run a poll, just to see from our participants here. So the first poll says, when it comes to sexual arousal, what do you think influences it most? Is it stress and anxiety? Is it relationship dynamics? Is it past experiences or conditioning? Is it biological factors, hormones, and medical conditions? Or I'm not sure. That's why I'm here. Okay. Erick, I mean, you probably know just off by heart exactly what the research says, what influences it most of those things listed there, or is it something actually completely different?
I don't think that's easy to answer, to be honest, because there are not many studies that really directly compare all those types of influences. When it comes to impact on our sexuality, I personally bet that tiredness might be one of the most impactful and prevalent, you might say.
Hmm.
But all of these things can influence our sexuality, and but in different ways, in different directions, even. So
Yeah. It's interesting how well it's spread over because about a fifth of people said stress and anxiety, a fifth said past experiences and conditioning, about a fifth said biological factors, and then two fifths, 40% said they think it's relationship dynamics. So, do you think relationship dynamics do play a very big role in that, in arousal specifically?
absolutely, absolutely. Relationships can. Well, gee, where do we start? The thing is, it's of course not the relationships themselves, but what happens in those relationships that's most influential. Some studies suggest or show that duration of relationships is even a factor, right? In terms of often people experiencing somewhat lower levels of desire or arousability over time in long-term relationships. Um, uh, you can, of course, think of everything from arguments to the experience of distance or even loneliness is as a common, not an uncommon factor. And so some of those things can be temporary. It can just fluctuate. This week you feel this way, the other week. Um, it makes me think, if I can throw that in there, of theory by Hatfield about passionate and companionate love. Have you heard of that? Um, so the idea is that passionate love, of course, comes very close to erotic love, and it's often very strong at the beginning of a relationship. Companionate love is often something that, of course, hopefully also develops over time within a relationship. But many people interpret that to be sort of like it starts with passion and a lot of sexuality, and then that sort of disappears over time, and you become best friends and buddies, and that to some degree can be true. But the theory itself and the work that Hatfield and others did about it show that actually they're kind of independent almost of each other and can fluctuate really over time. And can go down and come back up, and etc. So
Yeah.
anyway, there's a lot we can say about relationships and the impact on sexual arousal. But yes, it's one of many, I think, things that can impact people's
And
sexual
I think
response.
what I see in the practice is that people put such a high value on spontaneous desire and this very heightened arousal and eroticism and that natural attraction kind of feeling, and the companionate love, is that the right English word? The partnership that develops, is there is a lot of value in that. A tremendous amount of value in that. And if you rate satisfaction, people who have high levels on that side actually have high levels of satisfaction, even if the sex isn't that erotic anymore. Is that right?
The sex can still be very erotic and pleasant, but it may be less frequent and yeah, maybe not as intense or so at times. But yes, that's exactly how it can be. Well, there too, you mentioned things that make me think of there's now currently there's more theorizing and of about sexual desire in dyadic contexts. So within relationship contexts mostly, because you can experience sexual desire towards a specific person, or you can experience sexual desire just in general, and so. That may also sometimes not be exactly the same, right? You may
Mm,
experience, sexual arousal may be triggered by attractive people you meet, etc. Even if you may never act upon it or so, but feelings of desire are very normal and a very normal part of being human. But within a specific relationship, that may, of course, vary. And there are models now that focus more on what's called responsive desire. Basson is someone who's worked also based on her clinical experience on that sort of model that basically states that sexual desire doesn't necessarily just spontaneously come out of nowhere, but it is something that may be in reaction to uh, even things like intimacy, the experience of intimacy, or so. It may sometimes even mean that if all the conditions are right and you're feeling good with one another and pleasant and happy, that sometimes you maybe just start engaging in some sexual activity together and desire may follow. It may be
mm.
it's almost something that develops later. So there are so many different ways of experiencing desire, arousal, and the timing of it or the triggers for it. Yeah.
Very interesting. Okay, let's go over to the next poll. And that is, which brake gets activated for you most often? Is it your own worries about your own performance, feeling disconnected from your partner, feeling tired or stressed, negative body image, or none of the above, or not sure? Like, those are not actually relevant to you at all. Erick, you said that feeling tired, and this is also with feeling stressed, that is probably on a very practical level, just playing out in a lot of relationships. And I can also attest to that from the things I see in clinical practice. If people are not in a state where they can just be relaxed and have engage in frivolous activity, sex is often off the cards. Other people, if they are stressed, they actually want more sex. So you see that it's only about 13% of people that say they're worried about their own performance, and then 22% feels disconnected from their partner, and that puts on a brake for them, or feeling tired or stressed, almost 40% there. Negative body images being more turned towards worrying about their own body image, and that's a very complex concept. And we're actually going to talk about that in the World Sexual Health Day for next year at the World Association for Sexual Health, where we talk about every body and how bodies come into play when it comes to sexual health as well. So I think that will be interesting. And then some people think that all of these are quite irrelevant. So interesting to see where our guests are at. So, Erick, I'm going to go over to ask you the first question about what drew you into researching sexual arousal and the dual control model. How did all of this come to pass?
Oh, yes. Well, I was a student in psychology in the University of Amsterdam, and particularly fascinated by consciousness and emotions. So I studied emotions as an undergrad, and long story short, at some point I started talking with one of the professors, and he he became my PhD advisor later on, but he mentioned like, well, no, I think sexual arousal could is something that you could consider being among the emotions. And I that statement in itself that absolutely kind of blew me away because I had read a lot about emotions, but there was never mentioning mention of sex or sexual desire or arousal. And so I was completely new to this topic, completely. But I told him right away, kind of, I want to work with you. This is fascinating. And I did my master's thesis on the topic, and then I stayed on. So my first studies were on the psychophysiology of sexual arousal, but from an emotion theoretical perspective. And it is really, it fascinates me still because you still barely can find anything related to sexual arousal in emotion books, although there are exceptions, Nico Frieda, a theorist, and Peter Lang and others who take sexuality very seriously and put them under the umbrella of emotions, at least, states like desire and arousal. But yeah, in general, happiness is an emotion, right? That's how we view it. Anxiety, sadness. What have they? Well, a lot of those things have in common. There's a physical component often with anger or with sorrow. So there's even, your autonomical system nervous system may respond or not respond that much, but you may also sort of want to approach or move away. Anger is actually kind of approach. Anxiety is withdrawal. So there's a behavioral component to it. There's a physical component to it. There's of course a feeling component to it, and those things apply to sexual desire and arousal as well. There's a physical component clearly. There's a behavioral sort of. You probably want to do something with it. So there's a sort of an activation of that. So I got really interested from a pretty much theoretical point of view, but then we did studies on the psychophysiology of sex, and those studies ultimately led to the dual control model in that it really was a combination of factors. John Bancroft was a very well-known sexologist who did research in similar research, and was part of my dissertation committee and became the director of the Kinsey Institute right around the time that I finished my dissertation. And he invited me to come and join him. And so we both basically moved to the US. He lived in the UK, I lived in the Netherlands. And we had a lot of discussions about what our research should focus on next. And out of those discussions, those conversations, there were lunch meetings. I still remember them very vividly in the beautiful lunchroom at the campus of Indiana University. And yeah, I think some of the things I started realizing in our conversations is that I thought I had been studying the inhibition of sexual arousal in men with erectile problems, but kind of through this dialogue, I realized that maybe I had studied actually more the absence of sexual excitation. And that sounds very abstract, maybe, but it's the difference is sort of I thought I was studying the break, sort of really sort of push a suppression of sexual response, which is not the same as things that interfere with turning it on. Sort of, and John Bancroft's research was much more focused on actual suppression, because he found, for example, that men who would, I hope the next thing that I'm going to say is not too so explicit or confrontational in some ways or so, but a man would receive sometimes injections in their penis for with a drug like papaverine to induce erections, and some of those men would not get an erection even with that drug, and he was fascinated by it because they were men with psychological psychogenic, as it's called, erectile problems. So they could get erections in all kinds of situations, but not always when they wanted them. And yet that drug didn't do anything. So and there's no sexual context. It's not very sexy to have a needle going into your penis to induce an erection. And so he really focused on the suppression. There must have been something that prevented those erections, even with a drug injected in the penis. And while I was much more looking at the role of attention and the fact that if your attention is not in the right place, if you're worrying about your sexual response, that's not very sexy either. Then and you're distracting yourself basically through concerns about your performance, etc. Those were the kind of things I tested in experimental and psychophysiological studies. But then we're talking basically about things that interfere with the activation of sexual arousal. I hope this doesn't sound too abstract, but the basic this conversation resulted in a dual control model because we started seeing like, wait, there may be different influences, the activation of sexual arousal, but something may interfere with that, and there can also be active breaks or not, and maybe we need all of that to work well together before sexual arousal occurs. And so the dual control model basically states that sexual arousal and related processes, maybe even desire, are dependent on the balance between sexual excitation or the activation of sex, the gas pedal, and brakes. And in every situation, there's a weighing of those factors. So, this is an interesting sexually attractive person I'm meeting or so, but this is not an appropriate context. This is so the brakes are on. So there's this weighing, and that can occur in many situations. So that's one part of the model that we state that it depends on the balance between the suppression and the activation of sex. And then the other part of the model is that, and there's maybe more work done now with that part, sorry, is that people vary, we say, in their propensities for both processes. Some people are very easily aroused, and some people very easily lose their arousal because of certain threats or dangers or risks. And they can be, about your emotions, about feelings, about, feelings your partner may or may not trigger with you. And so people vary. Some people don't get inhibited easily at all. Kind of the ceiling has to come down during a fire before they lose their sexual arousal. And and we believe that those are independent things. So you can be someone who's very easily aroused, but also easily loses or inhibited or loses arousal due to all kinds of triggers, stimuli, cues, and we started studying that, and we have found a lot of support indeed in that variability and the relevance of those processes, because we thought that people who might have a high propensity, a tendency for sexual inhibition, may be more likely to develop sexual problems, sexual dysfunctions even, and people whose brakes don't work as well, so to speak, who do not lose their arousal even when, if someone you meet someone new and you have fun and you're having sex together, and then the person says, but I don't want to use a condom though. Okay, what happens then with your arousal? And people vary in that. Some people will immediately lose their arousal, like it's over, sorry. Well, they have pretty strong brakes when it comes to the sexual response. So it's not just behavioral decisions. No, your arousal goes. And others don't, and they stay sexually aroused. And that, of course, may make it more likely that you may not make the best decisions. So a not very well working brake, and we found that is a predictor of risky sex, all kinds of types of risky sex in terms of condom use, but also cheating on your partner, or even some forms of sexual aggression, which you can also see as a form of risky sexuality, basically, because in many cases people are aware of the potential negative consequences, etc. So the model is about sexual arousal, but it also immediately kind of showed its relevance for also understanding people's decisions related to sex and their behaviors.
Mm. It's fascinating. So, for us in clinical practice, what we see is the couple comes in and the one partner is frustrated with how difficult it is to excite their partner, or how easily their brakes are turned on. That they tell me that they are married to a person who is very difficult to get the excitation going, and you can hit the brakes very easily. That combination, is it something that can shift? Can you, is it like a, like, is it like a personality disorder? It's almost impossible to shift. People just get stuck in that, and all therapy in the world can't get them out of it? Or are people a bit more fluid? Do they move through this? How do you explain that?
That's a great question, and I'm not sure if we have the answers to that completely yet. We do approach it as more like a trait, like a personality aspect, because part of the work was also inspired by ideas that indeed people vary, and which is, by the way, very consistent with all the findings from Kinsey's work. Alfred Kinsey and his colleagues, what they really showed is that um, variation is the norm. The differences are the norm, and so the
Mm,
idea of having to have sex twice, whatever, a week or a month. He did not believe or even like those kind of thoughts, because we are different, and this model starts with the same sort of idea that even with children are some are very a lot, and how curious they are in their sex, in their own sexuality, and exploring their body, and right. So um, I think it's relatively stable sometimes, but it can change. Of course, it can change, and we don't know exactly all the factors that may play a role in it, or the experiences in people's lives. But what I do think is that doesn't mean that therapy, or that there's no room to deal. Someone can be very high on sexual excitation, and we have a questionnaire for it, and you can get really high scores on it. That doesn't mean you become aroused.
mm,
There's still something has to happen or so, and there may still be situations that don't do it for you, or and you may not be very arousable, but then it's possibly more important to look for what conditions need to be met for you to experience sexual arousal. What kind of stimuli, what kind of uh, cues, what kind of sensations work for you. So a lot of this has to do, I think, with know thyself, and same with breaks. I mean, yes, if you know what triggers your breaks, whether for some people it is indeed like, okay, the kids are in the next room, or you hear the dog bark. Some people are not distracted by that. Okay, and others are, and it's very well, then okay, that doesn't mean you need to change your brakes, but maybe you need to find a place where you don't hear the dog bark, or be creative, and but find out first what are the things that do it for you, that help the gas pedal or the accelerator. And if you don't have any of those, then okay, then you're someone for whom possibly sex is just not the most important part of your life, unless if it is, because it doesn't. We believe in all that variability, all that variation, and how easily you're aroused, how easily the brakes go on. It's normal variation, and that doesn't necessarily have to be combined with the experience of distress. No, there's a lot of people who consider themselves asexual, right? There are communities of people who consider themselves asexual. Well, part of the way I see it, the fact that those communities, online communities mostly, of course, exist, is that they went against the idea that they had a problem. because all the versions of our main manual for diagnosis of sexual dysfunctions, or one of them, the DSM, we had hypoactive sexual desire disorder. It's not in the current version of it. And they said, well, I don't have hypoactive sexual desire. I'm sorry, sex is just not that important for me.
Mm, mm,
And we do tend to pathologize that.
mm,
But of course, in a couple context, if one wants more than the other, and yeah, then you need to work on things and explore uh, indeed those factors, situations, conditions, whatever you need to make it happen for you. And people vary. But there may also be, especially within relationship context, of course, certain things that are underneath it that may need to be addressed first. Trust issues, or feeling close and safe, which may impact the break. But yeah, then it's not necessarily go look for sex toys or so to fix a problem. Then maybe you need to talk more about how you really feel with each other, and then if you work on those things, perhaps it kind of automatically opens up a little bit more again your responsiveness towards each other, and desire to do things together.
mm. Taking away a break in itself, like I don't feel safe, which is a big break, but then feeling safe in itself might be an actual accelerator. It's not only taking off the brake, it is actually hitting the accelerator. In sexual medicine, what we do is we look for biochemical influences on brakes, and try and fix that, for instance, like low testosterone, for instance. And then the test giving a person a testosterone helps them with their arousability clinically. That's the main place where giving transdermal testosterone in women with low libido makes a difference. So we can see in sexual medicine how it can often easily switch if you just fix things. If you stop that blood pressure drug that was giving the person a low libido, you fix it easily. But the psychological aspects, like the feeling safe and those things, are not that easy to fix often, I think.
um, yes, but yeah, but when it comes to hormones, we may look a little bit differently at that to some degree, because um, empirical studies do seem to not show much of a connection between variations in testosterone levels and variations in desire levels. So, and maybe if it's really, if you really are below a minimum level of androgens, and then I can imagine it having an impact. I don't know to what degree. I'm just going to be honest about it. I'm not a hormone expert, but what I know of research in this area is that even when it comes to hormones, it is complicated, and hormone patches may also give a psychological boost in terms of placebo kind of effects. And but if it's really clinical level, low levels, demonstrated, then I can imagine it being really having an impact. But the work that I know of shows that the connection between actual testosterone levels and desire levels that connection is not very strong.
Very strong, yeah.
Um, but still, I understand your point. Like, medically we can fix things, but it's always a combination of even a medical. If you are having a certain physical condition or so, that in itself can, of course, impact relationship processes, mood, and can more directly or indirectly also affect your sexual functioning in a more psychological manner.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. So I'll
but
I'll tell you from having treated thousands of women with testosterone. This is the story that you hear from them, and you can
yeah.
explain to me how you would contextualize that in terms of the dual control model. So they present with, they call it low libido because that's the common name that everyone has. And then when you talk to them about whether it is, do you never think about sex, is it difficult for you to initiate sex, do you find it difficult to say yes to sex, or is it that your body doesn't respond to stimulation anymore? That's often what you find in perimenopausal women, and as they go into menopause, that's what you find. They don't, it's difficult for them to respond. So if they have that history and you test their testosterone, it's undetectable levels of testosterone, and you then give them testosterone, the what I hear from these women is that, yes, saying yes to sex or initiating, that's more on a practical level. You're in a long-term committed relationship. You have to manage your tiredness and your resentment and you're managing your breaks. To people get used to managing their breaks, but then once you get going, what they find that testosterone does is it's much easier for them to then get to respond to that sexual stimulation in a positive
Mhm.
way, and then
Yeah,
become aroused and then have a positive
yeah.
sexual experience. So how would you put
Well,
that in terms of the dual control model?
so I absolutely don't question the fact that you need to have a responsive, it sounds very cold and scientific, but you need to have a responsive system. You have to have
Yeah.
something that's ready to respond. So, and of course, hormones play a role in that. So, um, if your body and your brain are not ready to receive or to respond, then not much will happen. So sexual excitation, so the gas pedal needs to have the machinery behind it to get the car going.
Okay. Yes. So
And
it's part of the machinery. So I see not having testosterone as a brake in itself, but you actually see it is the machinery wasn't functioning well enough for the gas pedal to be activated.
yes, I think
Yes.
exactly. It's not on the inhibition side, I would think, but
Yes.
it's not. You're low in responsivity, so it's
Yes.
on the gas pedal side.
Okay.
Um,
Fascinating. Yeah. Yeah,
that's
and
how
it
I
makes
would interpret.
it makes a difference in how people interpret their when they now go and address these problems. The side that they put it on, actually, I do think makes a difference. Could you maybe just give us a few things that would go on the brake side, that you just like a list that people, just things that you can think of that goes on the brake side?
Yeah, well, okay, that's actually a nice opportunity for me. There are different questionnaires for um, to sort of assess people's sexual excitation and inhibition scores, or their propensities for those processes. The original one that we developed turned out to have two components relevant to inhibition. So we had a lot of questions that we developed, and then you use statistics and all kinds of methods to come up with a final set that works really well statistically, etc. And for the excitation scale, we have all kinds of questions like, I easily become aroused when I hear an attractive voice on the phone, or we even have questions like, I easily become sexually aroused by lying in the sun, which may be more relevant to where you are right now than in this rainy weather here in Belgium. But some people actually say yes to that. Like, yeah, even taking a hot shower makes me already turned on. But it can be social cues, right? Fantasies, visual, obviously, erotica. And so all these questions are about, I easily become aroused by this, yes or no. And you say, or you don't say yes or no, you say, I totally agree, and I totally disagree, etc. For inhibition, we had also a number of questions, and some were more about I easily lose my arousal if I think I can be seen by others or so, that of course that's the interesting thing. For other people, that's a turn on. But also, I can easily lose. So all those questions are about I easily lose my arousal if there's a risk of catching an STD or things related to reputation or to. Um, but some of the questions we had in the original questionnaire were also more about not being able to. Or to have sexual arousal suppressed basically by concerns about your performance or that you're not pleasing your partner and so that's not really about excitation but what we discovered was that they ended up to be two different inhibition factors as we call them and if I would describe it in simple terms one of them is more about the foot brake in the car. You step on it when there's potential. Of course, you also step on it when you have arrived at your destination, and you step on it when there's a red light. But that is an indication of potential danger, right? A red light, because if you go through it, you are at risk. So when you step on that brake in situations that are potentially risky or dangerous, etc. But the other part of the other inhibition component, I see more like the handbrake in the car. And so you can still drive if it's up a little bit, right? But that doesn't make it very easy. And so we call that inhibition type 1, so to speak, and inhibition type 2. And that handbrake type of inhibition turned out to be very relevant to sexual dysfunctions. It's sort of like it's kind of always there, and it has to do indeed with how you feel and think about your sexual performance, how easily you're distracted during sex, how your thoughts are. Well, that's very much connected to ideas about mindfulness. So you have to be in the right place in order to experience it. So that handbrake type of inhibition is really about those kind of processes. While that foot brake
Yeah.
is more sort of what happens to you when someone when you having sex, making love together, and the others, your partner suddenly says or expresses something, sort of like, no, that doesn't feel good, or
Yeah.
what happens to your arousal then, or you feel very conscious about the part of your body suddenly. Those are more acute type of things
Yeah.
that can put the brake on.
You've
Uh,
definitely given me a whole new way of talking to patients about this, because when you do that if in a practical way every day, there definitely is a difference between the handbrake stuff and the foot brake stuff. And what for one person would actually be exciting is for another person just a handbrake, but it could be a foot brake at times or whatever. And these ones get married to each other. The one that finds the giggling and the playfulness exciting, to the other person it actually can be a complete foot brake or just a little bit of a handbrake.
yeah,
And it's easier if you talk about these kind of things. I think when you do counseling for a couple, like a third thing kind of a way, because they come in here accusing. She does not want to have sex with me, or he no longer makes love to me. And but if you can really unpack those things, it helps the couple a lot to get rid of all of the fear and the resentment and the anger with themselves and with each other for being in that situation that caused so much distress in that couple. Sorry, did I interrupt you there with your
no,
explanation
well
on
put.
the types of
No,
breaks?
no.
But Erick, I would think that, sorry, my light has gone completely funny there. I would think that medical conditions are like handbrakes. Taking medication that's really, as we would say, bad for sex. That influences, like if you take an SSRI or an SNRI, or these hormone problems in there. Don't you see them as like handbrake kind of things? It just makes it a little bit more difficult to go ahead.
Yes, but I cannot go too far with really. I can speculate about it, but with how much we truly know about the underlying neurophysiology in the brain, and whether it is more when you're talking about those types of influences, I should say, whether it's more interfering with your sensitivity on the arousal side versus
Mm.
indeed it puts the handbrake on a little bit while you're still driving, but you're wondering why it's not going a
Yes,
little bit
yeah.
easier and faster. So that's at the levels of sort of I see the model. Well, you can look at it at different levels. At a more modal level, so a higher level. Uh, it's a tool to sort of understand influences more in general that may facilitate or really inhibit, suppress sexuality. But the deeper you go look inside the brain and all the processes in the body that are connected to it, it may not always that easy to separate those. So it is
Yes.
partly conceptual model, but inspired by things we've known, from psychophysiological, from lab studies and related work. But yeah, um, I think some influences are more likely to just make it in general harder to get started. But yeah, then it comes very close, of course, to not being very sensitive
To
on the
excitation. Yeah.
yeah. So
Now I
but
love,
they probably interact and
yes, I love talking to you because I remember when I just started to get to know you. If I ask you something like that, and you kind of look to the side, and it looks like almost for a second it might look like you don't know the answer, but then when I start talking to you, I realize the depth to which you understand the nuances to this answer, because sometimes we have a very superficial way of looking at sex. It's the problem that we see in the clinical practice all the time. Men have high libidos, women have low libidos, nonsense kind of thing. So there's so much that we even in clinical practice as sexologists just assume that it's the way it is.
I know,
But
I know.
you
But
as
we
sex
all
researchers don't assume anything, and that's where the talent lies, in actually going and digging deeper and really getting to that answer so that we can translate it better into
yeah.
clinical practice in the end.
Well, trying to get the answers, of course. Well, with what you just mentioned, if I can jump in there, because that is, I think, one part of our work on the dual control model that I almost think may be possibly the most important part, and that is that to emphasize how much people vary in those propensities, in those tendencies, right? So and I do this with students all the time. I explain to them that there's so many studies out there now on the model, and they all kind of show that men, on average, have a higher scores on sexual excitation, and women have higher scores on sexual inhibition, both types of inhibition. But and that's statistically different, and that's true for a lot of things when it comes to sexuality, of course. Men masturbate more, watch more porn, they are more interested potentially, at least they may not act on it, but in sex with strangers. All those things have been looked at, meta-analyses, review papers, etc. But those average differences in all of those studies are not particularly large. And the differences among men in sexual excitation are way and way and way larger than the average difference between men and women. So in
Mm,
all of our studies, we find like that 20-30% of women are much more easily aroused than like 60-70% of all men. And
amazing.
a lot of men actually score very high on inhibition, don't necessarily experience sexual problems, and or they are not very easily aroused, according to our the scores on the questionnaire. Are those are not real men? So so it's variation that defines us. And yeah, those differences exist, gender differences exist, and often clinically probably you see more women than with lower desire maybe than men in the clinic. But then that's in the clinical practice, those are the the people who end up seeking help. But probably uh, no, most people don't see
Yeah,
sex or health counselors or therapists or doctors, and but that still. So even though clinically, see from my perspective, a model like that of Basson, responsive sexuality, is built on clinical experience, and those things are real. They happen, and there are gender differences, probably probably quite manifest in clinical contexts. But I don't know. I think there are probably also a lot of men who may not experience that much desire, but instead they report erectile problems,
absolutely. No,
because that's a
yeah.
real male thing to do,
50% of the people in my practice who present with low libido are men. 50%. I've got about a 50-50, but it's to do with the LSM that I serve, and there's a it's a certain population. You won't see that in every population presenting necessarily, but if you study them, as you say, you find the great variation. Erick, we have to just
Yeah.
also talk about the other interesting research that you have been busy with now more recently. If you can maybe share a little bit about that with us, please.
Um, yes, well, I think a thread through all my work is sexual arousal, trying to understand what it is, how it works, what are factors that facilitate it or interfere with it or inhibit it, but also how it affects, our decisions and so one of the topics I've been working on off and on for years, but lately a lot, is sexual aggression, also sexual aggressive behaviors. And partly because some of the more dominant, widely used theories of sexual aggression perpetration, or, which mostly focus on men, mostly heterosexual men, as the the ones who are most likely to engage in sexually aggressive behaviors. Most of those theories look at personality traits, hypermasculinity. There's of course a lot of research, definitely more and more these days, on the role of of alcohol and contextual factors. But there's actually quite not that much research that considers sexual aggressive behaviors sexual behaviors, that look at it from, but we're talking about sexual motivation, desire, arousal, and of course it's this very old discussion about, yeah, but it's about power, it's not about sex. Well, we are learning more and more. No, it is also about sex. It may also be about power, but it's also about sex. So we're doing research on the role of sexual arousal, including the dual control model, which has been found to also indeed, and especially the inhibition part of it, to predict sexual aggressive behaviors in men. More recently, we're doing some studies that we consider, yeah, pretty risky in itself. We did, as far as we know, the first study ever following young men while they were going to bars and parties and drinking, and I was almost going to say harassing them, but that's, given the context, maybe not very appropriate. But we would, every 2 hours or so, they would get questions on their mobile phone. And we would ask, where are you? What are you doing? How much did you drink? And so, like 2-3 minutes. And we had more than 80 men who did that for like 4 nights going out. And we have, so it worked. We could actually collect those data, and we asked them the next day, how much did you drink yesterday? And to see if those numbers are relatively reliable. And but what we found, and we just submitted this for publication, is that alcohol the consumption in those young men, those were mostly students in here in Belgium at our university, um, all the drinking sort of increased their self-reported sexual arousal while they were in bars, and parties. They would not say this increased my sexual arousal. No, we would just ask, how much did you drink? And how aroused do you feel? How much desire do you feel? And there was a connection there. Just the more they drank, the more arousal they reported. And that was also connected to objectification of women and thinking about, shall I try and approach someone, and their desire to end up maybe being doing something sexual later in the evening. One of the things that I find most interesting about is that the connection between drinking and sexual arousal, self-reported arousal, while in a bar. So not sexual arousal in response to something specific, like no, how sexually aroused do you feel? And of course, that's connected to feelings of horniness and desire, etc. But that connection was the strongest in men who had a history, self-reported history of sexual aggression, who had, who admitted to having done things in the past. For them, that connection between drinking and arousal, sexual arousal, was the strongest in this study. And so
Sure.
uh, it's just an example of how you can sexual arousal and desire can clinically be a challenge and a problem, but it can also go in different directions. Hypersexuality can be, or sex addiction is sort of the high end of it all, and can interfere with people's lives in other ways. And but it can also make people do things, and it's an emotional state. It is emotions affect our behaviors.
Fascinating. Can we just say two sentences about your interesting porn research that you're doing at the moment?
I'm very proud of this, by the way, with a group of colleagues in Flanders, so the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium. Belgium is already like this. You can't even see it. It's small, and then there's the Dutch-speaking part, which is even smaller. But there are several universities in Flanders, and we managed to get funding from a national foundation to study porn use in young people. It's a very large project, and looking at many different aspects of it. Studies with parents and with schools, and because obviously sexually explicit materials, porn is a great example of a topic that immediately, yeah, calls up all kinds of responses in people. Just saying the word porn is, and some people are going to be like, and others is more like, okay, well, no. So, right, there's so many different types of attitudes, feelings, etc., connected to the topic. Yet we still don't necessarily understand much about how it really fits in people's lives and the impact it can have, positive or negative, because we have attitudes about it, we have ideas about it. Porn is bad, porn is wrong, but indeed, scientifically, we have the responsibility to look at really what do we really know about all these things, and it's not something that's going to go away anytime soon or easily. It's only becoming more and more accessible, and young people have to also find ways to give it a place in their lives or not, to deal with its presence. And so in our own project, me and my students, we look at the connection between porn use and what we now see in some studies, potential negative effects on sexual function in men. There's some studies that say, porn can use ED, can use erectile problems. And we're going to explore that in more depth, also with psychophysiological studies and also those mobile phone sort of types of studies where men can indicate. We just about to start a study in which relatively young men will report on porn use and sexual arousal alone with a partner, and etc. So porn is a subject that incites a lot of different feelings. Scientifically, there are really camps, even among researchers, who just mostly focus on negative impact and more positive, because there are studies that show that if couples use it, it can be quite positive for the relationship. But we try to look at all of this as little as biased a way as possible. But it's an important project, I think, and if I can add this to it, it's like 2.5 million euros that we got for this study from the government in that tiny
Amazing.
country. And believe me, not just now, the current situation in the US, but also 10 years ago or 20 years ago, we would not have gotten that sort of grant in the US.
Yeah.
So good things can happen, but not always in the places maybe where you expect it or would like them to be. So
Amazing.
I'm very excited about it.
And I think what we spoke about a lot when we were in Porto with the World Sexual Health Assembly is how important it is that the work that the research that we do does actually also influence policy and helps to inform it. That's what I would like to believe, that your government believes that it's important for them to really know about this in order to be able to, I mean, I don't know to what extent it's legislated or should be legislated, or to what extent it should be included in sex education or whatever. We need to learn from it, and it's wonderful that they are investing in it so extensively in order for us to learn from the research that you do. So Erick, this is probably the most amount of money that anybody is ever going to receive for porn research, so use it wisely.
Well,
No pressure there.
I'm happy I'm not responsible for it alone. So it's really with a team, different universities, and again, it includes qualitative studies or interviews with parents and with schools, and it's really trying to work towards indeed materials and ideas for school programs, which of course is another. Sex education in itself is, of course, just as polarized in terms of how people look at it as a topic like pornography. And one of my colleagues is doing research on exactly that topic, the resistance to, or to sex education programs, and what all plays a role in that, because it all goes back to ideas about sexuality and to what degree that belongs in the public domain or privately, and right, and to what degree it is okay or not okay to teach children about things that I would consider very important: autonomy, the right to say no to whatever kind of behaviors, and that sort
Yeah,
of.
course.
But age-appropriate sex education is a challenge, and it's complicated. We've had in Belgium some schools that were literally burned down 2 years ago because people were against the
Yeah,
sort of sex education programs that they thought were going to be implemented there. But
yeah, very polarized.
yeah.
Ah, Erick, well, you and I are quite used to sitting in meetings together, very, 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 very crazy long meetings. But this one doesn't have to be long. But it's been absolutely wonderful to have you on our webinar. Thank you for being present here and sharing literally a whole career's worth of experience with us in such a short time. It's been a great learning opportunity for me. And I am certain our audience has also really enjoyed it, and
I
we
hope so.
appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure and an honor, and very happy to have done this and been here. And I hope people indeed found it somewhat interesting. And happy holidays, if it's not too early to say this.
Thank you very much, Eric. And thank you to Lisa for running the show in the background for us. Thank you to everyone who joined us for this webinar. It was a privilege for us to share space with you here. Goodbye. Bye bye.